Okay, so welcome to this panel discussion, a co-production of the Kiosk, a newly launched independent media coalition in partnership with Plebity and India and Global Left. I'm Willy Maley, and my co-host is Elke Heydecke. Our guests are Kim Stanley Robinson, author of Ministry for the Future, a wide-ranging and thought-provoking book about the climate crisis that is the jumping-off point for today's discussion, and historian and Latin American expert, Professor Aviva Chomsky, author of an important work on this topic, Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions about Climate Justice. So welcome to you both. And I'm going to hand over to Elke to open the discussion now.
Yo, thank you so much for taking the time out of your presumably busy schedule and being with us. And I just noticed I'm sitting in my kitchen. You have all these books there behind you. So I'm sitting at the West Coast in Berkeley, but I'm originally from Germany, from Berlin. I grew up in West Berlin. Not that that might matter, but that it might explain my accent. And also, what I was thinking when I looked at the picture here is like that my experience of having fruitful discussions often happens in where people convene with food, with some drink, like tea, water, whatever. And so food for thought as well. And so I'm really happy to be here with you guys. Yeah, look at this.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I wanted to kick off the discussion with a quote I read yesterday from the CEO of Exxon, I think. And he said something like, oh, we have all these possibilities to make fossil fuel, produce them more with less pollution and stuff, but the people, they really are not willing to pay for it. And so I wanted to kick off the discussion with, like, what does climate justice look like? And maybe I hand over to you, Avi.
I mean, I guess I would start by saying with the people are the ones who are paying for the misdeeds of the fossil fuel companies, because the majority of the world's people are at, well, all of the world's people are at great risk, but the global south, if you want to think of it like that, are the populations that have gotten, like many of us, despite the fact that we're put at great risk by climate change, also have enjoyed a lot of the benefits of fossil fuel production, and the consumption that goes along with it, and the emissions that go along with it, and have managed, at least until fairly recently, to feel pretty protected from the social and economic and climate impacts of it. But the global majority and the global south have in general not been able to enjoy the advantages, that is energy poverty, in the form of not only not having access to energy, but not having access to clean water, not having access to healthcare, and some of the positive things that increases in energy production have brought to many of us, but are also suffering from the most deleterious effects of the rapidly heating climate and the inability to produce the subsistence goods. They're also the people who are displaced by fossil projects as well as by climate change. So it's like the same people are paying all of these costs, both the costs of the production itself, the costs of the overconsumption, and the costs of the climate change.
Yeah. And so just as a quick follow-up, when the CEO of Exxon talks about the people, do you think he's addressing his talk to the people of the global south, or is he
No, I mean, he's talking nonsense, but I think what he means is that US consumers aren't willing to pay the high prices that would allow us to continue to make the profits we believe that we need, while also investing in technologies that are going to supposedly be cleaner. And, you know, I think that the big energy companies, whether they're state-owned or whether they're publicly traded corporations, have grown fat off of state largesse. And I'm not talking only about the United States, but many of the world states are in fact petro-states, whether the state themselves owns the fossil fuel industry or whether it's privately owned. But they have grown fat off of living off of state largesse. So when they say that the people aren't willing to pay for it, first of all, they're assuming that with a little more money, if they got a little more influx, they would actually be able to continue to make the same profits while reducing the emissions from their fossil fuel production, which is a kind of a dubious proposition. But at the same time, what they're saying is that the people aren't willing to pay for us to continue making profits.
And Stan, what comes to your mind?
Well, thank you for this, and I am in agreement with what Avi has been saying, and would extend it to say that this is, from the novelist's point of view, this is a rare case of personification, where you can say a whole industry, a whole world situation, our infrastructure can be represented by a person, this CEO, who is wrong, badly wrong. And so it's easy to personify and say it's just that person, but he's representing a point of view that is on the wrong side of history. And essentially the fossil fuel industry is sitting on stranded assets. They are scared, but they also have been, as Abby pointed out, the driving productive force, the energy source for the last century or so. That the wastes of that process have poisoned the earth and in its atmosphere is a somewhat of an accident of physics, but to continue to defend it now and press for more of it when we know the biogeophysical situation is verging on the criminal. So one can say, okay, let's nationalize these private fossil fuel companies and own them by government. This would be a very, Chomskyan move, you might say. But on the other hand, even if they were nationally owned petrostates, those are still stranded assets, and pushing them on the public, you can't even call them energy companies anymore. They are fossil fuel companies. There could be a green, renewable, clean energy that they could invest in. They have the technology to do geothermal. They have the technology to put in wind power offshore. That fossil fuel industry could transition, and maybe it needs to be pushed that way by government regulation and action, by nationalization, or it might just be a fight in the world of the marketplace and ideas. But of course, these subsidies have grossly distorted the actual costs of the various processes, so that right now solar and wind are in effect cheaper to install, cheaper to run, cleaner for the earth, and should be an instant replacement. But because of subsidies and because of the immense financial / political power of the fossil fuel industry, why they continue to fight on the wrong side of history is a mystery of psychology that I don't think is even that interesting, but they definitely have to be fought, because there is green industry. There are people in business looking at Exxon and Aramco and saying, why aren't these people just getting with the wave of history that is necessary? So I think you're tagging a kind of one of the battlegrounds right now that it's extremely important. And maybe as the discussion goes on, we can talk about the petrostates themselves, which is a different angle on the problem. They've basically signed their own financial destruction by signing the Paris Agreement. They're looking down the barrel of bankruptcy because they're sitting on stranded assets that they've agreed not to sell and burn, but they need to sell and burn them in order to keep going their governments, their police.
When you say stranded assets, I'm not completely sure what you mean. That is a term I have not heard before.
Coal, oil, natural gas, still in the ground. We cannot burn that. We can burn about 500 billion more tons of it, but we've identified 3,500 billion tons of it underground that is owned, that is assets on the books, that has been used by these companies and by these nation states to make loans and to borrow. And so all of those assets are nevertheless promise not to be burned. There's 3,000 billion tons of coal, oil, and natural gas that we have to leave in the ground, or we have torched this planet and wrecked civilization. So in that situation, when you're the responsible party, you can speak nonsense, as Avi called it, which is quite true, and say, oh, well, we can't afford to change. We have to destroy the earth because we can't afford to do differently. It's Keynes that said anything that we have to do, we can afford to do. So making the correct financial arrangements here is really the problem we're talking about. And there are allies in business, in big business, that are ready to make the green transition. So there's a bit of a war of the elites going on that we need to try to pitch in on the right side.
Yeah. So there's a
Can I just follow up by asking you something, Stan? Because this is something that really intrigued me in the book and listening to you speaking now. And I also just have to say, it's one of my favorite books. And people always ask me, what's a good book to read? It's the one I always recommend, whether they ask me about climate or just in general.
Thank you.
But I feel like in the book, you clearly identify aspects of capitalism as part of the problem too. That is the drive that the business model has to be based on profit and on constantly producing more in order to increase profits. And so that the fossil fuel industry certainly has played a big role in the rise of capitalism and the continuation of capitalism, and energy has obviously played a big role, but that I felt like you were a little ambiguous in the book, because you certainly talk about alternative economic models and, other ways economies can be organized. So, but sometimes I feel like you're suggesting that capitalism could work, and sometimes I feel like you're suggesting that we need to be exploring alternatives to capitalism.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I've been grappling with it, especially in these 3 years since Ministry came out. I come to the whole of our moment in history as a leftist. And so it's been puzzling to me to ponder the situation that we're in, trapped in the nation state system and in global neoliberal capitalism, and a climate crisis that is crushing us now, so that I have been pondering what we can do now, trapped in the system that we're in, that will deal with the climate crisis effectively, without just increasing inequality and giving more power to capital. It's a hard one. And I guess my solutions have been proposed you could possibly call Keynesian capitalism, or is left liberal a thing, or is it code in America for social democracy? And is it possible that we could, in this crisis, propose a Keynesian government seizure of the economy, of government over business, that would be absolutely the end of neoliberal capitalism, and yet use the already existing mechanisms of power to solve the climate crisis, and in doing also perhaps hammer on the inequality crisis and support the global South. So this is a kind of a kludge, or an improvisation, a bricolage of what we've got now, the financial instruments available to us to create more equality and also solve the climate crisis by doing green work as government driven. So carbon quantitative easing. You see it in my novel. The carbon coin is a kind of symbol for any number of financial instruments that are being proposed that haven't yet been enacted very well, but they do exist. So a government over business, public over private, and hoping really for an eventual landing point that you could still call kind of eco-socialist. That if we really were to take away the malignant power of capital, private capital, to just rush for profits at the destruction of everything, if we were to bulk that, we would have created a post-capitalism. So that's how I've been trying to think it through.
Well, I actually feel like I have a little bit to challenge you on that, because I grew up in I would say, overall, like social democratic environment from the early 60s on in Germany. And we even had like the Green Party, very grassroots, that made its move into the parliament, and we had a lot of the like main institutions more in public hands. And this, I think it was overall 10 times better than neoliberalism and where we're moving right now. But it also throws a global south under the bus, and basically was based on that the global south is providing for our social democratic welfare. Welfare not meaning as welfare here, but welfaring for the society.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. None of the when socialist parties took power in Europe, they were spectacularly bad at enacting actual socialist reforms, and that's discredited them as political parties. And so now you see the strong tilt to the right. But that, I think, is partly fear-based, that if you have to make a choice between trusting the international global order and all the other people in the world versus setting up fences and borders and putting your head in the sand and doing a nativist, populist nation state first type response, you can see some people out of fear draw inward to their own country and hope that that will work. And it will not work. But there's a lot of people who realize that will not work, that it's a global problem, a planetary problem. So as the planetary problem presses us, it's possible that enough people in the democracies and in the authoritarian states, particularly China, will see the necessity of the green transition. And that helps the global south. That's where it needs to happen. They need to jump from no water, no toilets, no electricity to a green technology that provides them with all those things without going through the fossil fuel stage. This is a full employment program. It requires an international understanding, but it leads toward maybe I shouldn't use the word social democracy or even socialism, maybe just a mixed economy where government pushes private capital to do the green things that will save the climate, which nobody can prosper. If the climate catastrophe goes to its worst in cases, nobody will prosper, even the capitalists. So there are some capitalists see that already and are pushing a green, clean transition and pushing for justice even. It's a war of ideas and a war of amongst the most powerful, the elites at the top, some of them saying, look, we can't sustain this and it's wrong to begin with. Others are saying, oh, well, sorry, but we're going to go down with the ship. And that ideological battle, battle of ideas, battle of stories, that's the only part that I myself can join in on, the battle of stories. So I insist on the importance of that, and also that it's not a unified picture. You can't talk about the 1% as if they are a unified front, because they're not. They're immensely powerful, but they're not unified amongst themselves as they see the catastrophe.
We've touched on the nation state, and obviously not all nation states are equal. And a word that we haven't used yet is colonialism, as well as capitalism. And we've talked about the global south. We're sitting in the global north. And I suppose one question I would have, although we've got expertise in the global south, is who leads on climate justice? Who leads, or who should lead? And what are the prospects for those colonized nation states and colonized stateless nations and so on, who, in other words, should we be looking to the global south for lessons and leadership and not just thinking of this as something that's going to come from the global north, as it were? That's what interests me. Is there an anti-colonial as well as an anti-capitalist way forward and on some of this that isn't being taken into account when we think of it's the West, it's Europe, it's the global north, it's the big corporations, it's United States and so on, and maybe not thinking about where the alternatives might be rooted right now?
Avi knows this.
Yeah, Avi knows, because that's where her expertise also lies. Yeah.
So, I mean, I do think that there has been a tendency in the global north to talk about environmental justice or climate justice, thinking kind of within national borders rather than thinking globally. And I think that thinking globally is really crucial. I also feel like I don't want to romanticize poverty of the global south by saying, oh, people of the global south know how to live with nothing, and so they have to lead because they know how to live with nothing. But at the same time, I do feel like we need to understand the flow of resources and the flow of waste. That is, basically capitalism has been global from its very first inauguration, and it has been based on the environmentally destructive extraction of resources from the global south overall to be consumed in the global north, with the waste shipped back to the global south. And if we think about climate, that is exactly how it happens. If we think of the waste as being the CO2 emissions, like they don't go directly to the global south, they go everywhere, but the global south is where they're most suffering from them. So it's kind of a metaphor for the entire 500-year history of capitalism and colonialism. At the same time, I feel like so much of global power is concentrated in the global north in terms not only of the wealth and power of the countries of the global north themselves, the corporate wealth and power, but the way the international economic system is structured, the international financial institutions, the trade agreements that, I do a lot of work in Colombia, in the coal mining region of Colombia. That's my biggest connection to the global south is my work in Colombia. And it is like the essence of the global south that you are describing right now, where it has been, for hundreds of years, primarily subsistence economy, Afro-Colombian and Afro-descended and indigenous people who live with basically very little access to energy or water or healthcare and schools and all of the basic needs that we would hope that people could take for granted. And they're being displaced by one of the continent's largest open pit coal mines, where the coal is exported to Europe and the United States for us to be able to continue polluting, and thus also contributing to, not only because of the mine's direct deforestation and use of really scarce water resources, and also because of its depth, destruction of the water table, the groundwater, but all factors contributing along with uncontrollable factors like El Nino and La Nina, but also because of the rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and global heating or warming, to an incredibly severe drought in the region. So on one hand, like the solutions have to come from the global north in a way. And when we go to Colombia, and I take delegations there every year, or I did before COVID, we're just trying to get that started again now. everybody goes down and they say, oh, well, what can we do to help you? What can we do to help? And they want to like send money or, go volunteer there or something. And the people always give us the same answer, which is that the mine will never listen to us. The biggest weak point in this multinationally owned mine, right? It's gone through a number of different big companies from Exxon to BHP Billiton and Anglo American. Now it's owned 100% by Glencore, Xstrata. Their weak point is their public image. And you are the only ones that can attack their public image. You have the voices, and we need you to do your work in your country, and we need you to be there at their shareholders' meetings, and we need you to be there in terms of government regulation and international law. Like, you have access to all these things. We don't have access to any of these things. We're lucky if we know how to read and write and where we're going to get water for our children tomorrow. So on one hand, they're saying, go home and do your work. Don't try to help us. But at the same time, I feel like, and this is almost another kind of extraction, but when I give talks or bring up Colombians to give talks here, the audience is always saying, well, what can we do? What can we do? We don't have any power. We're so powerless. We don't know what we can do. We're so powerful, but we don't recognize our power. Whereas in Colombia, nobody ever wonders what they could do. They are so mobilized, like their lives and livelihoods are at stake. And every single day, they're in general strikes, they're in civic strikes, they're blockading the highways, they're blockading the mine entrances, the unionized workers are supporting the communities that are being displaced. And so there is a level of social mobilization and social organization under the most adverse conditions where nobody has the luxury to sit back and say, oh, but there's nothing we can do because the system is so big that we can't change it. So I feel like one of the biggest lessons we learn when we go to Colombia is not, oh, here people know how to live with nothing, although that is a lesson that people learn. Like, they say, oh, when I go home, I'm going to wonder why I have to have so much stuff all the time, why I have to have a 4x4. Like, now I see what 4x4s are for, like going on these dirt roads for miles and crossing rivers and up mountains. I don't need it in my suburban home. And understand the impact of our overuse of energy, but also that they learn something about political activism and mobilization that is just, despite all of the activism and mobilization we can say we see here, is nothing compared to what we see there.
Well, that kind of like brings up for me is this question of like, what are we defending here in the global north? So when we look at our personal lives, we often feel like there is not enough money for this or that. And a lot of people are actually also worrying about where does the food come to feed my children tomorrow, also in the global north. And so I often ask myself that what would motivate people basically to not only advocate for, okay, I think what I'm kind of like getting to is the question, would poverty be what our global justice would look like for the global north? Or are we holding on to our individual freedoms? Or what is it that it holds us back from really standing up against it? When you talk about the people also in the 1%, Stan, it's like, why would I want to leave the decisions to this 1%? Why is it that it's so hard, so sticky to get people together and to actually stand up for, in a way, for their own rights? But it seems like there's some scare, something like, if I would do that, I actually would reduce my even already very hard life. What people like in comparison, I think it's not hard, but.
Let me just say something more about Ministry for the Future, and then I'll turn it over to you, Stan. But that was, I feel like a good part of it is our failure of imagination. We can't imagine other narratives and other ways that things could be. And this was one of the many things I loved about Ministry for the Future, is that it actually like pushes the bounds of what we can imagine for what kind of change could happen. And some of it is fantastical, and you read it and you think this couldn't ever possibly happen. And then you realize that what we're doing now can't possibly happen either. So like we have to be able to push those bounds of imagination. And I do think that for subsistence societies that are seeing their livelihoods destroyed before their eyes, the capacity to imagine alternative roads and alternative solutions is greater than it is for those of us who are schooled on the cultural hegemony of the global North.
Yeah, thank you for that, Avi. And I want to continue to follow this Colombian strand that you know so much about, because I would have questions to ask you, because I've already been using it as an example of what I want to call the virtuous petrostate. And because the petrostates are in terrible trouble of bankruptcy and social breakdown because of the lack of police, teachers, airports, everything that governments provide, that these petrostates will not be able to provide. So the danger is extreme. So we need to compensate the petrostates, but so many of them have been corrupt kleptocracies. So Colombia is my candidate for what you could call a virtuous petrostate that fits norms of democracy and decency as governments. And when Petro and Marquez won this extraordinary election, one of the pink wave, the return of leftists to power in Latin America, so important, and said, we don't want to sell and burn coal anymore. The fifth biggest coal producer on earth. They should immediately have been helped by the international community with that project. So what would that entail? And I've been thinking about this as a somewhat science fictional project that I see aspects of in the real world already happening, thank God. There would need to be an agreement. Okay, we're not going to burn, we're keeping it in the ground. We sign an agreement to that, and then you get compensated for it in a way that would be discounted to what the old profits of fossil fuel burning were like, because those were always false, but discounted, but amortized over time, so that a payout over the next century, because it would have taken that long to sell that coal anyway, etc. And then some entailments that the agreement would say, we're going to spend what money we get to decommission all this stuff and keep it in the ground on green projects. This would be a shifting of capital from the global North. And to follow Willy's point, colonialism never ended. It only shifted to a financial regime of debt rather than a military regime of force. It's better when it's debt only. You let the locals enforce it, but you keep them in debt, and the colonial shift of money and resources from the colonized to the colonialist powers never ended. And that's what is called the Washington Consensus for a while there. The neoliberal order is profoundly colonialist. How do we decolonialize in a way that is quick and effective and affects both the climate crisis and justice? Well, there's the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty. Maybe that's a mechanism. There's, surprisingly, I say this, the International Monetary Fund has started issuing special drawing rights, which is the name for loans that they don't need to have paid back. Well, what is that but something they don't even want the powers of the world to understand? I believe they've named it vaguely in order to cover what they're doing from examination. $500 billion has already been distributed under this special drawing rights program of the IMF. And the World Trade Organization, now headed by Dr. Ngozi, who was finance minister of Nigeria, another potential virtuous petrostate, along with Venezuela and South Africa and several other giant petrostates that need help to transition to the clean economy, and it should come from the global North. This could be government driven, but private capital enabled. And the WTO, Dr. Ngozi said, I want the trading rules of the world to be just and sustainable. Do it now. And they weren't before. They were part of the Washington Consensus. They were part of colonialism. post-colonial neo-colonialism that was financial. For those organizations to say, we want to become mechanisms for a transition to a more just and sustainable world, this is change. And I freely admit this is change that is maybe top down, but it's also the people in power recognizing that power itself will evaporate on them if they don't change, that their power will melt away, that these institutions are pointless unless they actually address these pressing problems. And I see action. So I see it at the level of private capital. I see it at the level of government and international diplomatic organizations, treaty organizations. There is a rising set. It's uncoordinated, and nobody has really, except for the IMF, nobody has really put money on the table to start this whole process moving. But I see that there's maybe you could call it a balked momentum. More and more forces are coming into play that says, since we have to change, we better change in an orderly way, or we're going to have chaos. And the signs are there.
Where is that so different than what the Belt and Road Initiative is? What you describe. What is there so different, what you describe, what the Belt and Road Initiative by China is? Aren't they doing
Belt and Road?
Oh, but Belt and Road was it had some interesting aspects to it, but it was also colonialist. The indebtedness of the companies that took Chinese loans, they would then be in Chinese pockets forever as colonial subjects to China. That semi-succeeded, semi-failed, and the projects were not green projects. They were fossil fuel. They were continuing the old economy. Nevertheless, as a mechanism, it's just like World Trade Organization or any of the Washington Consensus US-led colonialist ventures. If the mechanisms were green and just, then if the goals were green and just, and those projects were being supported by World Bank, by AMF, by Belt and Road, then it isn't the internationalist aspects that are necessarily wrong. Since we have a global problem, we need global solutions. The big rich nations do have to help the developing world. So it's almost like the forms are not bad, the content was bad. And so if the content were made good, decision-making by these units of international power, influence, money, and development, if you can use that word in any meaningful way, if those were all made green and just, then those might be okay international organizations, or global North and China reaching out to the global South and saying, we will provide capital and expertise to help. But then if it wasn't just another hook into debt, if it didn't oppress workers and use them like tools to be tossed aside, if it encoded environmental justice and green projects, then bad can be turned to good, and we need that.
So I would go back to what Willy was asking earlier about, should we be turning to the global South for solutions? And I think in terms of talking about global economic structures, there have been plenty of solutions put forth by the global South, not just now, but over hundreds of years, 100 years. Another one of my favorite books of the last couple of years was Adam Getachu's World Making After Empire, where she looks at the history of anti-colonial thought, especially in the Black Atlantic, and how small a piece national liberation per se was of Black anti-colonial thought in Africa and the Caribbean. The new international economic order has been a permanent demand of the global South since World War II and decolonization. And it's a pretty well fleshed out plan for what a different kind of international economic order could look like, a just international economic order. And it includes terms of trade, it includes erasure of debts, and the debt jubilee movement is also a huge movement in the global South. It includes reparations. with the idea that all of this is a way of creating a more just global economy. But another thing I wanted to look at in terms of Latin America, and I love you calling Colombia a virtuous petro state. I presume no pun intended there, but this is the election of Gustavo Petro.
It's a good name.
Yeah. That one thing that happens when leftists are elected in Latin America, there's several things that I mean, we've seen this happen over and over again. First, often because of the way the elections and political systems are structured, even though it happens in the US too, is that a candidate is elected into the presidency but doesn't control the Congress or whatever the legislative body is. And that is the case in Colombia as well. And that severely restricts the capacity of a leftist in power to actually bring about the kinds of changes they want to bring about, because they're constantly at war with Congress, or whatever their version of Congress is. And the other is that if they do succeed too much, and especially because the ability to challenge the Congress and the owning classes, which includes foreign investors, depends on a certain degree of popular mobilization and popular support. And when that popular mobilization and popular support actually starts to threaten elite interests, and again, we've seen this again and again in the first half of the 20th century, and in the slightly different ways in the second half of the 20th century in the context of the Cold War, you have this alliance between national elites and the United States when it's Latin America, but in some other parts of the world, it's the former European colonial powers there, whether it's France or Britain, to make sure that it doesn't happen, whether it's by a coup or by assassinating the leader or by judicial coups or sanctions. These things are happening right now. So I almost feel like Petro is playing a very delicate balance between being able to remain in power, being able to carry out some of his agenda, and not alienating the forces that are going to destroy him if he goes too far. But the other thing, of course, is that Latin America, if you look at it historically, has a pattern of electoral swings. Like, the political spectrum in Latin America is much bigger than the United States. And in the United States, too, we see alternation generally between what we call the left and the right here, which is basically the right, all of it the right. But in Latin America, you do see significant swings. So there's the pink tide, where all these leftists are being elected, and then there's the pink tide recedes, and all these rightists are being elected. In Brazil, you go from Lula to Bolsonaro, and then back to Lula. Same thing in Bolivia. So any kind of structures or relationships have to transcend who happens to be in their versions of the Oval Office, because that's going to change, and it's likely to change in a dramatic swing. But I also wanted to mention the case of Ecuador, where when Rafael Correa, and that's also one of the reasons that we see so much, and not only in Latin America, but everywhere in the global South, and Adam Getachew talks about this too, the levels of corruption. Part of the reason for that is the impossibility of third world leaders, no matter how radical they are, of carrying out any of their agenda. And they end up giving up, and the only thing they can get out of office is some perks. Because they simply cannot, and they see those who start to take those steps, they're just out. So, that's one of the factors. But looking at what happened in Ecuador under Correa, because that was a case in which Correa too came into the office with a very, keep it in the ground agenda. And, he was the one who proposed to the United Nations that you have to compensate us for keeping it in the ground. And everybody said, oh yeah, somebody else will pay for that, not us. And so the project actually failed because the global North wouldn't support it. Right. So there have been over and over again chances for the global North to actually allow redistributive and environmentally sound forms of social change in Latin America. But those threaten elite interests, and they threaten U.S. corporations, and not only U.S. corporations, European and Korean, and all the investors there, and they simply have not been allowed to happen. So it's not only a question of developing mechanisms to support; it's almost more a question of developing mechanisms to rein in the evil that's coming from us that doesn't allow. And, there, over and over, we've seen these historical moments where Latin American popular movements coming to power, candidates being elected to power. I'm thinking of the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979, or, even the Cuban Revolution in 1959, where the response of not only the United States, but the international institutions is, we are not going to let this happen. So reining in the evil has to be also really prioritized.
Well, I can only agree with your analysis, and I don't want to sound Pollyannish. It has been, as you say, and that could go on forever. When you read Piketty, you can see him throwing up his hands at the difficulty of reducing the economic power and the political power of the oligarchs, of the plutocracy. And most democracy around the world has been a false front, or easily manipulated by money that takes over the popular press and then sways enough people's minds that the right wins elections, and then capital wins again. And that the same with Keynes, the euthanasia of the rentier class that he called for. After World War II, the oligarchs were blamed for World War II, and there was popular movements worldwide that threw off military colonialism and created more social democracy in the global north. And that too faded with the neoliberal counter-revolution of 1980. Keeps on happening. Power is powerful, and money is power, and money is aggregated at the top in stupendous amounts. So it's difficult. But where I'm finding hope is there's now a war going on amongst the oligarchs. The enormous pressure of the climate crisis, it could wreck everything. And then the oligarchs are simply being murdered by their bodyguards, and their children are having their heads chopped off in physical terms, not just financial terms. Under that enormous pressure, I'm seeing, and this has been the last 3 years of my experience, 550 conversations like this, luckily mostly by Zoom in terms of my own personal carbon burn. But what I've been seeing is that you can no longer use the term elites to mean the stupid, greedy, short-sighted, evil ones that are simply doing a Götterdämmerung and saying, look, okay, I'm going down here. And if I'm going to go down, the whole world's going down. Those people are there, and they're in power in many places. And so, but no longer should we use the word elites, because we are all elites if you talk about the world and income and education. And some elites are fighting their damnedest to try to make a better world, scientists in government, in business, in academia. And other elites are doing the Götterdämmerung and sticking their head in the sand, or doing their damnedest, as in villain style. And they have their own self-justificatory stories, but these are irrelevant in the larger world picture. They're on the wrong side, and the climate pressure is causing schisms amongst the oligarchs. Some of them are saying, look, we can't go on this way. Maybe justice would be safer. Maybe I only need to have 10 times as much resources and power and carbon burn as the ordinary person living at sufficiency. Maybe everybody should be at sufficiency. There is a moral pressure behind the physical danger. And I would just say we have to press on that. We need Johann Rockstrom from Potsdam to remind us that if we create a hothouse Earth, civilization itself is shattered, and humanity won't go extinct, but it might be reduced from 8 billion humans to 1 billion humans, or even less. That's bad enough. That absolutely catastrophic pressure of the danger we're in right now might cause political change. We need to tell that story and make that happen, and not allow the Götterdämmerung to happen. So it's a war of the elites. There is obviously, of course, a need for everybody on Earth to press their politicians vote the right way, to tell each other the right stories and be in solidarity all across the board. I mean, it's an 8 billion person effort, but that 1% at the top is no longer a unified force of evil. This is, I've observed this, and I think that's one place where some of us can fight the fight.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is circling back to Elke's original question in some ways. First of all, I don't think we should downplay the military dimension of colonialism today, because I think it's still very present. When you think about the weapons industry, there's still invasions and occupations in order to source resources. That's what
in conjunction with sanctions.
Absolutely. And sanctions, which is a kind of siege warfare, which has been going on for hundreds of years, but sanctions are effectively siege warfare, the starvation of civilian populations in order to extort resources. But I was actually thinking about the balance here between the dystopian, which is a realistic and frank assessment in some ways of where we are, and the utopian. I mean, Engels talked about socialism, utopian or scientific, and of course he came down on the side of the scientific. But since then, a lot of socialists would maybe go in the direction of the utopian, because we need some utopianism. We need some blue sky thinking of the kind that's in Ministry for the Future. We need to have to think about, as Elke and I were saying earlier, how do we, when we're witnessing the breakdown of an old fabric, social fabric, where is the new fabric being knitted, and how do we turn apathy into activism, or how do we, and is it through science? I mean, both of you are rooted in science. But what or are there other ways of engaging, dynamically and making people think and change by informing them? Because so many people are ignorant about empire, about colonialism, about history, but even about these companies that as it were run the world. So I just wonder, what is there a utopian vision, which is also a necessary, urgent, and realizable vision that we can put forward for making some kind of breakout from the impasse that we seem to be in?
Avi?
So when I was preparing to reread the book, because I read it when it first came out in 2020, and my entire extended family read it because I made everybody read it after I read it. I was talking at one of our family meetings, and my brother-in-law, who is Nicaraguan and is not a native speaker of English, like everyone else had read the book, and he said, I never read that. And I said, well, it's a very long book, and I don't know if it's been translated into Spanish. So he said, well, tell me what it is. And I said, well, and this was before I had reread it, so I was relying on my 4-year-old memory. I said, it's a dystopian science fiction-y novel about climate change. And my son, who had also read the book, he said, dystopian? It's utopian. And then I read about the book, and I realized we're not the only people having this debate. Is the book dystopian or utopian? But as I was rereading it over the past couple of weeks, and it is a very long book, and my schedule has been very busy over the last couple of weeks. That's just why it took me a couple of weeks. But I was thinking about that question, but I was also thinking about how differently I read the book now than I did 4 years ago. That is, the physical impacts of climate change, I think, are so much more visible to us now. And it's so much clearer to me how, it's like the frog in the water that where you slowly raise the temperature and the frog never notices until it boils to death. That when I first read it, some of the scenarios in that book seemed so futuristic and dystopian, and now they feel like every day, and we've just gotten used to these things. The wildfires, the heat waves, the massive deaths from climate disasters that we have sort of accustomed ourselves and gotten used to those. So I mean, I still haven't decided whether it's dystopian or utopian, but I mean, one of the things that I appreciate about the book, and even just listening to you, is I tend to be much more pessimistic about our future, and we need that kind of optimism that you bring to the book. And, as I read it, like, maybe there is hope after all. But Willy, as you were just speaking, the world you were describing, I just couldn't help thinking that you're describing what's happening in Gaza right now. The starvation, the sanctions, the military, and like the sense of hopefulness at the global mobilization against this, a lot of it coming from the global South, but also from the global North. And, at my own university, I was out tabling with our students for justice in Palestine before I raced home to come on to this meeting. But also the feeling like, yeah, we keep doing all these things and mobilizing and nothing comes of it. South Africa goes to the World Court and nothing comes of it. The UN Security Council passes a resolution and nothing comes of it. Like, we have all of these institutionalized ways to protest and they don't make any impact. So yeah,
and then there's even Germany sending the second biggest amount of weapons there, and I can't really, and it's not, I don't hear anybody of people I know in Germany are in support of it, but it's still happening. And so I share your rather pessimistic view, even though I really appreciate, I would love to have something like, to imagine that there is a carbon coin. But then the first thing that comes up in my mind is like, but who is in control of it? And
well, I want to insist on the utopian, and as a student of Frederick Jameson, you can immediately play the game of the dialectical game. Really, that's not just Jameson, as he would be quick to point out. Dialectic thinking would say you can. Utopian is Bill McKibben called it anti-dystopian, that you oppose dystopia. Since we're not doomed, since the future is not set in stone, since we make history, there's always the chance of doing better rather than worse. And the two can be defined in stories. And there's also Joanna Russ, the great feminist science fiction writer, so funny, so angry. She had this term, the optopia, the best that can be done, the best that can be done given the situation that we're in now. And that can be fought for. And that's really what the Ministry for the Future was. But I wrote it in 2019, and Optopia then, what I thought of as a best case scenario, has changed. And I want to report, for me personally, it's changed for the better. Things I thought I was making up were already enacted in the world. There is a network of the central banks, and central banks are ultimately run by governments. It's another kind of financial UN going on, the network for greening the financial system, 90 central banks trying to think up a carbon coin. And also the pandemic. The pandemic was a huge accelerator in our sense of history and in history itself. So there's been a great acceleration since World War II. Every single way we study humans shows that intense acceleration in history. But in 2019, I was thinking, we're not paying attention to climate change enough, and it's going to destroy us. I was angry, and my timelines were all predicated on a thought that we were stuck. Now, 4 years later, 5 years later, everything's been accelerated, and things that I thought would happen in the 2040 are happening right now. And this is basically good, although the catastrophes and disasters are happening right now too. And we have very little time left in terms of sea level rise and in terms of tipping over the tipping points, the famous tipping points. So on the one hand, the speeding up is the speeding up of the disaster and the catastrophe of climate change, many of them. And then, but also the responses are speeded up now, the awareness of it, the way that climate change has jumped right to the center of world history. Something like Russia's brutal attack on the Ukraine can be explained in climate change terms of a petrostate going bad, an evil petrostate seeing that its fossil fuels are no longer going to make its living, and then seizing the breadbasket next door just simply for food, or failing to seize it. That climate change is now the central driver of world history, and capitalism won't cope with it. So we're in that Gramscian moment. The old order has collapsed, fallen apart, and is a zombie, and tries to hold on to power in zombie style, but it's not succeeding. The new order has not yet been invented, and is going to be a matter of improvisation in this interregnum that we're in. So the 2020s are only going to get crazier, wilder, and more volatile feeling. But the, the the game's not over. And so we are in a wicked fight, a wicked political battle to do the right things. And there are some aspects of capital, of gigantic accumulations of money, that are stupidly thinking that money is real and that they can sit on their hoard like a dragon, a miser. But there's also many people, well-educated, well-meaning, and they like their children, they like their grandchildren, who are thinking, oh my gosh, things have to change. What should we do? And that's where the utopian story comes into play. We should do this. And luckily, this is not, I mean, one could say, oh my God, I'm the only one telling this story. Not at all. I'm reporting on it, a story that's being told by millions, or created, acted on by millions, planned out. And so you can try to orchestrate and tell that story to spread it. You can be part of the network. And that's what we're all doing.
Yeah, I think we can think global, act local. But I thought that was really interesting what you were saying in terms of, because I think the book, I just only read your book recently, and I think it's very much about now and about the ministry for the present. And it's a really contemporary novel. I didn't think of it as futuristic at all. And I suppose there is that thing of, if you think you can't change everything, that doesn't mean you can't change anything. And I think there can be all kinds of local interventions and contributions and so on in small steps. And that's part, it might be fragmented, but I think that's going to be part of what is the engine of change, if we're going to have change. It really is all these local kind of cracks or pinpoints and so on of change. But I think the book is very contemporary, and I think in that sense it's an intervention. It's not a projection. It's an intervention into the here and now, and it's descriptive. It's not prescriptive. It actually says something about where we are. And I think even though that you can find that debilitating, you can find it paralyzing, you can find it depressing, but I actually took a lot of hope out of it, because I am a Pollyanna. I am utopian, but at the same time, I'm by background and so on. I'm Marxist, and I believe that change is possible, even though there's no easy road towards that change. But I do believe, and I think Avi's absolutely right to take the example of Gaza, for instance, and say that has led to a global mobilization. And even if that hasn't led to a ceasefire, withdrawal, or instant change, I think that's still a shift. And I think those shifts in sensibility and consciousness and collective action and demonstration and protest and so on, I think they're really significant. You know, when people criticise Extinction Rebellion in the UK and say, well, how can you turn around this great tanker, as it were, with a little rowing boat? But I think you have to find ways of contributing and intervening, even in that micro level, and to believe that that's something that can contribute to change.
Well, thank you for that, Willy, and thank you all. I saw that in Glasgow. I was there for COP26, and I walked in all three of the parades. It was sometimes just across the street, but I definitely marched in all three of the parades, and that was a beautiful thing to see. I got very fond of Glasgow as a city and as a political space. And I think that's true all over the world, the local levels, the regional levels. Although I've been focusing today on the top-down war of the elites, everybody in their town has the potential to be a climate activist, and you see it a lot. And in fact, Extinction Rebellion, those women in London breaking bank windows, that was a much cannier political action than lying on freeways, because it imitated the suffragettes' actions for the vote in the early part of the 20th century. So it had historical precedent. And then it targeted the banks that still invest so intensely in fossil fuels and so stupidly. So that was a great little intervention. And that the judge and jury declared them innocent by way of an overriding necessity that made them do it. This was world historical, and hopefully it will lead to a further action on that level. But then the constructive work of just doing climate work in terms of planting trees and changing levees and the like, the actual physical work one can do is very satisfying. I mean, I came back from Glasgow and joined my little community here in Davis, California, to do green work here. And I think I see that movement too. I hear more about chapter 85 in my book, which is simply the list of already existing environmental organizations, and it takes about 15 minutes to read it aloud. It's indicative of what matters to people, that list of organizations is more moving to many a reader than anything else that happens in the novel. And that's the right response too. So I appreciate it.
Perfect.
I went through the pandemic, or after the pandemic, I experienced a very deep, like not belief in the social fabric, or I felt that the social fabric has further like unwoven itself. And reading through your book, I felt at least, well, maybe the known social fabric has unwoven or is falling apart, but there might be a chance to, if we're staying with the reality and we'll have those kind of utopians in ourselves, then and try to start weaving something that would encompass all. And I found in your book, Avi, also the like, what can the individual do that is so needed? Because often we're put into this place like, yeah, we know we're in the global north, but nobody really is telling anybody besides feeling guilty, what can I actually do? So thank you both for that. Telling stories, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, and there's common ground, which I think is wonderful and necessary too. Are we drawing things to a close now?
I just see we're 10 minutes over our time, so
yeah,
I really want to be very mindful of our panelists here.
Yeah, I'm quite cavalier with time. But so I'd just like to thank Avi and Stan for writing these wonderful books, for bringing your expertise to the table. We've been so informed, and for engaging, and I know you've done it with me, engaging and activating and informing and agitating and so on, and angering and so on, and making us want to do more and be more involved. So thank you both.
It's been a pleasure to talk to all of you. Appreciate it, and onward. I hope we meet again. Thank you. Good to meet you, Avi, and thanks for everything. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. This was really interesting and wonderful to meet you all.